The transition between 2- and 3-dimensional video games is perhaps the largest transformation in the history of the medium. As far as consoles go, the first generation to be made with 3D games in mind was the 5th generation, the Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation, and the main focus of this video, the Nintendo 64. Many hail the Nintendo 64 as one of the finest consoles ever produced. It had a library packed with games that shaped the future of the gaming media, with games like Super Mario 64 setting the standard for 3D platformers, Ocarina of Time becoming what many consider the first true open world, multiplayer smash hits like GoldenEye, Mario Party, and Super Smash Bros., plus dozens of other classics that I'm not going to have time to mention. The N64 is without a doubt a beloved console, but there's one thing about it that frequently draws criticism: its controller. Mention the N64 controller to a typical gamer and it will inevitably be the butt of jokes. I'm not saying the N64 controller is perfect by any means, far from it in fact. There are definitely things about it that could be improved. I do own a Brawler 64, and definitely prefer it to an original controller, as it does fix the complaints that I do have about the N64 controller. It's just an observation of mine that many of the criticisms made about the N64 controller are not entirely based in reality, at least from my perspective. So, the main thing that's criticized about the N64 controller is the 3-prong design. There are constantly jokes about how the controller requires 3 hands to use and that it's an awkward, uncomfortable mess. However, this never really added up to me. The 3-prong design does appear unwieldy, but it does serve a purpose. The 3 prongs means there's multiple different ways of holding the controller. Think back to what I said a moment ago about the 5th generation being the transitional point between 2D and 3D games. When developing the controller, its primary designers, Nintendo R&D 3, would have had no way of knowing whether the emerging trend of 3D games would be a success, or whether gamers would lose interest in them and things would go back to predominantly 2D. As such, they literally went with a multi-pronged approach to cover either eventuality. The player can grip the outermost prongs to have access to the D-pad and the face buttons, as well as both shoulder buttons. This arrangement is ideal for 2D games as it essentially replicates what's on a Super Nintendo: D-pad, face button, and shoulder button. There's also the grip mode using the middle and the right prong, giving the player access to the analog stick, face buttons, and Z trigger in place of the L trigger. This ended up being the main controller grip used by most N64 games, since most of them were 3D games controlled with the analog stick. Finally, there's the left and middle prong grip. This one is rarely used as the player can't use the face buttons while using it, making it a pretty limited control scheme. However, it can be alright for some games, like an FPS, giving access to both the D-pad and the analog stick for the 2 axes of movement. I will admit this isn't ideal, as the majority of the control elements are inaccessible, like the face button. But I personally find it better than toggling between moving and aiming like in GoldenEye's default configuration. Critics of the N64 controller often point out that none of these 3 configurations allow the player to have easy access to every single control element at once. While that certainly is true, and a certainly less than optimal design choice, I would argue that in the end it doesn't really matter, since few games require you to actually use all of the control elements. Contrary to what a lot of people will say, game designers aren't stupid. They knew when designing a game not to include a control element that would be out of reach for the player. I've had an N64 since childhood. In fact, it was my first console, and in all that time, I've discovered that on only very rare occasions do I ever need to use any grip other than the middle and right grip. Pretty much all your 3D platformers, the Zelda games, Smash, Star Fox, almost any big-name title that still gets played a lot today, you'll be using the right side grip. There are a few big-ticket games that use the D-pad, like Mischief Makers and Kirby 64, but these are exceptions rather than the rule. The one real exception is FPS games, where not having both the D-pad and analog stick is a handicap. But again, the left-aligned configuration does mitigate this in games where it's an option. It is unfortunate that a console with so many classic FPS games has a controller that hinders them. But let's be real, most of them have improved modern ports or remakes that are a better experience than the original anyway. This does mean, however, that the whole left prong of the controller ends up being more or less redundant a lot of the time. The D-pad and the L button don't see a lot of use, unless you're a Smash player who likes to taunt a lot. And yes, this means the N64 controller is a suboptimal design. But at this critical transition point between 2D and 3D gaming, R&D 3 wanted to make sure all their bases were covered. It presents options. It may not present them in the most efficient way, but it presents them nonetheless. So, all said and done, I don't hate the 3-prong design as much as a lot of people do. Although, here's an actual criticism I do have about the N64 controller: the analog stick. The analog stick on the N64 controller is a pretty bad one. The main problem is that it's got a plastic-on-plastic design, meaning that as it gets used, the components grind against each other and wear out, often pretty quickly, especially if you happen to own a copy of Mario Party 1 back in the day. These days, it's gotten difficult to find original N64 controllers with sticks that haven't been destroyed. Not to pat my child self on the back too hard, but I took pretty good care of my gaming stuff, so the controllers that I have from back then are still in pretty good shape as far as their sticks. And for those so inclined, there are quite a few options out there for modern replacement sticks that improve over the original. Plus, even when the stick does work, it's just not great. It's prone to poor calibration, and the slightly weird shape of the octagonal gate makes it weird to do directional inputs. The analog stick is the main reason I prefer the Brawler today. But even with all of its problems, I do have to cut the analog stick some slack. Again, this was new territory. An analog stick was basically a new invention at the time. Sure, there were joysticks of the arcade and the Atari age, but those were usually binary input, where you either move or you don't. With the analog sticks, there was actually a fine control of movement that was relatively new. The only implementation of analog control before that were knobs like on Pong consoles or the Atari 2600's paddle controller. Bottom line, I can essentially forgive the analog stick's flaws because it was still an experimental thing at the time. And not to make this video about the competitors, but it's worth noting that neither of the N64's main rivals even had analog sticks when they first released. Both the PS1 and Saturn controllers only had a D-pad at launch and lacked the option of analog control entirely, making 3D games kind of awkward to play. Of course, Sony did soon rectify this with the DualShock, setting the standard for one of the finest controller layouts ever. Sega with the Saturn, though, not so much. What the hell is this thing? And you have to choose between the D-pad and the analog ball, I guess you call it, with an actual switch? If you ask me, this is the controller people should be making fun of. But at least the Dreamcast analog stick is okay. Anyway, the point is, the whole industry was still figuring things out when it came to fluid movement in 3D games. It wasn't something unique to Nintendo. Before I wrap this up, I want to mention one more thing I like about the N64 controller: the expansion port on the controller itself. It was a clever way to add functionality to the controller after the fact without having to release an entire new controller revision. The Rumble Pack, of course, being the biggest example. It is a bit weird for memory cards to use this, but given the lack of the console itself having ports for something like that, it's a better alternative than nothing. And of course, being able to put your Pokemon on the big screen in Pokemon Stadium using the transfer pack was mind-blowing to my kid self. I wish more games had a use for this accessory. In any case, that's about all I have to say. I just wanted to give a rundown of what I often felt was an unfair criticism that comes up almost any time the N64 itself does. Maybe I'm biased because I grew up with it, and an N64 controller is second nature to me, but I try not to let that cloud my judgment, and keep an open mind when it comes to the things that I like. But like anything, it's my opinion. I just wanted to present my thoughts and see if maybe I could change yours. What do you think? Did you always like the N64 controller? Still think it's bad after hearing what I have to say? Or did I maybe change your mind? Let me know down below. In any case, thanks for listening to what I had to say, and have a great day.